Being a fan can sometimes be complicated. I've talked about the Trails series a lot on this channel, whether it be in their own videos or in passing, and I've been vocal on how much I love the series. But it's worth noting that I've been far more lukewarm on the most recent titles. Cold Steel 3, 4, and Reverie are games I would file closer to games I like than games I recommend. Despite enjoying my time with them, spending 5 entries with the same group of characters felt tiresome towards the end. Beyond that, there's the same nagging questions you get when you don't like something new as much as something old. Is the series going downhill? Is it just not for me anymore? Yeah, fuck that, Trails through Daybreak is amazing. Some issues certainly linger, but Daybreak proves the Trails series is at its best when exploring new settings, stories, and character arcs. And the result is one of the best RPGs I've played in years. Let's start with the big question. In my opinion, yes, you can start here. Trails is a long-running series in which every game takes place in the same world at the same time period. Characters from earlier titles will often cross over into newer installments. The easiest comparison is the MCU, down to the big team-up in Cold Steel 4 that I've described before as Avengers for weebs. But it's not as simple as one continuous story. The series is divided into arcs, with each arc featuring a new cast of characters, setting, and main conflict. While there are references and returning characters you'll miss, you can reasonably start with Sky FC, Trails from Zero, and Trails of Cold Steel and have a complete experience. This holds true for Daybreak, with the story centering around a new party and their struggles and triumphs. These aspects are the focus, and while you'll absolutely miss some things and need to use context clues in a lot of cases to recognize the characters are referencing events from previous games, there's nothing here that takes away from the focus on the new. Additionally, while the game does reference past events, it's most often discussed from the perspective of people who weren't there for them and only know about them in the general sense. This means that if you like Daybreak, you can go back and play previous titles without having much of the specifics spoiled, although obviously with the broad strokes like the state of the world, some of it is unavoidable. There is one aspect of the main story that calls back to the events of Trails from Zero, but again, it's something you can use context clues to understand. Considering how many improvements are stacked into this game compared to earlier installments, I have no problem with anyone starting here. It's not necessarily the best place to start story-wise, but it is the highest quality game when it comes to starting points in the series. Trails through Daybreak takes place in Calvard, a gigantic nation going through a massive economic and technological boom. In a lot of ways, it's the Trails analog to America, a mishmash of cultures and viewpoints that's tough to really put into one bubble. It makes for a compelling setting, with cities like Edith and Orosion that echo old Trails installments contrasting well with locations that explore vastly different cultures. Part of what makes the Trails world compelling is it's essentially a continent going through hundreds of years of technological advancement over a much shorter span. Seeing the formative steps into things like cars, movies, and phones is oddly engrossing. You play as Van, a fixer in the city of Edith who solves problems that are too morally gray for the police. He's hired by a student named Agnes to find devices invented by her grandfather Epstein, an enigmatic man who spearheaded the previously mentioned technological revolution. He wrote in a journal that his creations must be assembled before the end of the decade or the world will end. After finding the first of these, Van turns into a weird demon monster thing called a Grendel, which understandably piques his curiosity. This leads to him aiding Agnes in finding the rest of them. On the surface, it's a pretty standard find the MacGuffin and save the world plot, and for much of the game it is. But as the series very much built up Epstein into a figure of importance in previous titles, it adds an element of intrigue. There's a sense that at the end of this journey you'll start to find answers to some of the mysteries the world has built up. But with Trails, it's important to know that the end of the journey isn't necessarily the end of this game. Daybreak is the first game in what is at least a trilogy, and there are going to be some unanswered questions at the end. However, this is by far the most complete experience Trails has put out as an arc starter. The search for the Genesis devices gives way to an organization using them to cause havoc. This group also has ties to Van's past, as it's slowly revealed over the course of the game before coming together in a conclusion far more potent and self-contained than what I expected. This is a full experience, don't expect a cliffhanger ending like Trails in the Sky or Trails of Cold Steel. The format of the game sees you exploring the main city of Edith at the beginning of each chapter before you're sent on a job to another city across the absurdly large nation. You'll get embroiled into some conflict surrounding the job while also taking side quests around the city that better flesh out the new setting and the characters involved. While there are certainly moments where Van's moral ambiguity comes up, for the most part this is standard RPG questing stuff like finding cats or killing monsters. Still, the story elements of these quests are at a higher standard than you'll usually find. Everything is very well planned out to flesh out each setting into something distinct and memorable by the time you leave, with the exception of the first chapter being a pretty nondescript village. If you're the type of player who likes to talk to all the NPCs, this game is basically designed for you. The NPCs you meet while exploring Edith are all named and have dialogue that changes with each chapter, and it fleshes out the city even more. Like previous installments, Trails is best enjoyed when you can embrace its slow-paced nature to really appreciate the care that went into establishing the setting. But the real strength of the game comes in its characters. This has always been the biggest draw of the series, seeing deliberate, well-written character arcs that play out over the course of multiple games. Daybreak being able to push the reset button and introduce a new cast provides a reminder on how compelling this hook is. Many dialogue problems like the overuse of anime tropes remain from recent entries, but because of the strength of the rest of the story, they're barely noticeable. The new group is fantastic, and the earlier characters especially play off each other extremely well. There are a few characters that don't join until late that I wish got more screen time, but it's not enough to be a mark against the game. Van serves as a more static lead for the younger cast members to grow around, and he ends up being a much more interesting main character because of it. The result is one of the best protagonists and one of the best casts in any JRPG I've played in a while. This strength, combined with the incredibly well-written setting, elevates the story beyond its simple premise. Everything in the story comes together in a package that most JRPGs just don't reach. On the combat side, Trails Through Daybreak has seen some massive improvements compared to previous installments and does something very few games ever have by mixing action and turn-based elements. This is something I think a lot of people focused on leading up to release, but in reality it's still something like 90% turn-based. When exploring around, you'll be able to engage enemies with action combat or put up a barrier that begins turn-based combat. This action combat is incredibly simple. You have a basic attack, a dodge roll, and a charge attack. The flow here is meant to be stunning an enemy with a charge attack, then popping the barrier and beginning the turn-based section with a preemptive attack. For weaker enemies, however, you can choose to just smack them around in the real-time battles if you don't want to bother with a turn-based fight. Almost all important story battles and boss battles operate purely as turn-based, and that's where all the progression, special attacks, and builds are used, so it's best to consider this a strictly turn-based system that allows you to beat up weaker enemies quickly on the field if you want to. Still, the brief action segments at the beginning of a fight give the game a nice sort of flow, and entering a battle after softening up an enemy and blasting them with a preemptive attack never stops being satisfying. The turn-based combat is still somewhat standard, but has a great deal more depth and customization. You're given the option to basic attack, cast a magic art, or use a combat craft, and yes, the special moves are called arts and crafts. I'm embarrassed at how long it took me to figure that out. Basic attacks and spells both generate a resource called CP, which is used for special moves. Spells are stronger than basic attacks, but have a cast time, and you can use a large amount of CP to fire off a gigantic super move. All of this is pretty standard stuff, but there's a few new systems as well as a layer of polish applied to the combat that elevate it beyond being just okay. First off, the animations are smooth and polished. Attacking next to an ally will have them follow up quickly, standing near them will power up your spells, and these animations are fast and flashy. Spell effects and attack animations are suitably cool, and everything just seems to flow much better than previous installments. This is the first time I've ever gone through a Trails title without ever using the battle speed up feature because the visuals involved with the combat are so much more refined. Persona 5 proved that there was nothing wrong with a turn-based game having mass appeal as long as there was enough care put into the presentation of the fights, and Trails Through Daybreak appears to have learned that lesson. The new systems involved with building your characters are also extremely welcome. Power level has been dialed back a bit here. By the end of Reverie, you would have quartz and equipment that would turn your characters into unstoppable killing machines using special moves every turn. By comparison, Daybreak is thankfully more measured. Outside of battle, you'll be able to equip quartz that give stat buffs as well as contribute towards unlocking new abilities depending on where you equip them. Early on, this stuff is simple, like recovering MP when you enter a battle or starting a fight with a minor stat increase. But later on, you'll be able to unlock some game-changing abilities like following up magic attacks or shielding characters to drastically reduce damage. It's not perfect, as early fights can be extremely samey and magic is incredibly weak for the first half of the game, but once you start getting access to more unique quartz and more slots to equip them, it's incredibly rewarding to tinker with a character to get the perfect set of abilities. Seeing Anyas turn from a heal bot into a nuclear bomb is an awesome feeling because it takes planning and time, giving the combat a really nice sense of progression. The other new feature is S-boosts. Each character can equip an item called a Hollow Core. Rather than giving big stat buffs like past installments, it governs what your S-boost does. These can range from lowering spell cost or cast time to increasing damage at the cost of defense and a lot of stuff in between. You need to use a shared resource to activate these, with them lasting for a few turns. If you double up on the boost, it'll increase the duration as well as give you access to your ultimate ability called an S-Craft. While S-Boosts in general are fine, it feeds into the biggest weakness of the combat system. You can activate your S-Craft at any time, advancing to the next spot in the turn order. It also doesn't use your entire bar, it costs 100 CP out of a maximum of 200. This means that if you fill up your bar, you can activate 2 of them back to back. You're even given a small damage bonus based on how many attacks you've done before the enemy can respawn. This means that far too often the best strategy is to just spam your S-Crafts over and over. For as much care as the rest of the systems have received, this is a frustrating oversight. As a whole though, there's far more good here in the combat than bad, and it's a big step forward for the series. What is also a big step forward for the series is the overall presentation. Falcom developed a new engine for this game, and it's immediately apparent. This is obviously still a budget game, which is abundantly clear if you look at certain textures for too long, but it's a massive step up from previous installments, especially with improvements such as being able to enter and exit buildings without a loading screen. But the real star here is the music. Trails is generally pretty good music, I use it in my videos all the time, and Daybreak is no exception. A big portion of the soundtrack falls in the realm of just okay, stuff that works well enough but isn't super memorable. But while there's certainly some lows here, the highs are so high that it's probably my favorite soundtrack in the series. From the sad but welcoming piano of the main menu theme, to the manic synth of the Grendel battles, to one of the later city themes that's so good I'm not going to play it here. I'll link it in the description, seriously go listen to it. It perfectly captures the vibe of taking your first steps into a city as a tourist as you go from hesitancy to wonder. Much like everything else in the game, the presentation is a massive step forward for the series and measures up to the best in the genre. You should play Trails Through Daybreak. There's reasons not to. It's not the first game in the series, it's a relative budget title, it's slow paced and goes on too long, but the fact is it's too good for me to give it anything but a blanket recommendation, and it's too good for those circumstances to prevent you from experiencing it. It's just a flat out fantastic game, from its presentation to its combat to character writing that stands out as the pinnacle of the genre. In a year full of fantastic JRPGs, Trails Through Daybreak is the best one I've played. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing or leaving a comment. These videos take a long time to make, so if you're interested in supporting the channel, I'll leave a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Also, some footage I'm using here is from the Japanese version of the game with the English patch, so if some dialogue and pronunciations don't line up, that's why.